The Sleeping Beauty. Many years ago, there lived a king and a queen who had an only daughter, and she was so beautiful that at her birth the king knew not what to do for joy, and he appointed a great feast to celebrate it. He invited not only his relations and friends and his whole court, but also the wise women, in order that they might be kind and bestow favors upon the new-born princess. There were 13 of these women in his kingdom, but as he had only 12 gold trenchers for them to eat off, he could not invite them all. So one was left out. The 12 who were invited came, and when the feast was over, they began to bestow their wonderful gifts upon the child. One gave her virtue, a second beauty, a third riches, a fourth modesty, and so on with everything that is good and valuable in the whole world. But just as the 11th had finished bestowing her gift, in came the 13th, who had not been invited, and began to threaten vengeance for the affront which the king had put upon her. The maiden, she said, when she comes to her 15th year, shall pierce her hand with a spindle, and shall fall down dead. At this the king and queen were grieved beyond measure, but the 12th fairy, who had not yet bestowed her gift, stepped forward and spoke. She could not indeed, she said, prevent what her sister had determined, but she could mitigate it. The king's daughter, she continued, shall not die, but shall fall into a deep sleep, which shall last 100 years, at the end of which time a king's son shall awaken her. And when she falls asleep, the whole palace will sleep with her. The king, who was very anxious, if possible, to ward off this misfortune from his dear child, made a proclamation that every spindle should be sent out of the kingdom, and that none should be seen all over the land until the princess had passed her 15th year. In the meantime, the wishes of the fairies came to pass, for the maiden grew up so beautiful, so modest, so amiable, and so intelligent that no one who saw her could help immediately loving her. Now it happened one day when she was nearly 15 years old that the king and queen went from home, and the young princess was left quite alone in the palace. She walked about through all the rooms and passages, and wandered hither and thither as her fancy led her, till at last she came to an old tower. Here she saw a narrow staircase, which she mounted, and then she came to a little door. In the lock of the door there was a rusty key, and when she turned it round, the door sprang open, and there she saw, sitting in the corner of a little room, a very old woman who was busily employed with her spinning wheel. "Ah, old granny," said the king's daughter, "what are you about there?" "I am spinning," answered the old woman, and nodded her head to the princess. "How merrily that thing goes round," spoke the maiden, taking the spindle in her hand at the same time. "Let me try if I can spin too." But scarcely had she touched the spindle when she pierced her hand with it, and the enchantment took effect. That moment she fell down and sank into a deep sleep. She was then carried to a chamber and laid upon a beautiful couch, and no sooner was this done than the king and queen and their servants and the whole court and everything about the castle fell asleep likewise. The horses and grooms slept in the courtyard or in the stalls, the dogs in the kennel, the pigeons on the roof, and the flies on the walls. Even the very fire which flamed upon the hearth became still and slept. The roast ceased to hiss, and the cook, who had caught the kitchen girl by the hair to punish her for some fault, let go her hold and fell asleep. And all that had the breath of life was still and slept. And now a hedge of thorns began to grow all round the castle, which hedge every year became higher and thicker, until at last it closed in the whole building, and not even the chimney tops could be seen. And the story of the beautiful sleeping thorn rose, for thus was the princess named, was told throughout the land, so that from time to time many kings' sons came and tried to force their way through the hedge into the castle. But it was all in vain, for the boughs kept together as tightly as if they had clasped each other's hands, so that the youth stuck fast among the thorns and could not get out, and after struggling and tumbling about for a long time, they one by one died. After many long years had flown by, there came another king's son through the land, and he heard by chance from an old man the story of the thorn hedge, and the king's sons who had been killed by it. The old man also told him how it was said that there stood a castle on the other side of the hedge, and in the castle the beautiful princess Thornrose slept, and with her the king and queen and the whole household. Then the youth said to him, "The thorn hedge shall not frighten me. I will force my way through it, for I am resolved to see the beautiful princess Thornrose, if it should cost me my life." But the day was now at hand when the 100 years were to expire, and the spell to be dissolved. And when the prince approached the hedge, the thorns appeared to his sight only large, beautiful flowers, which separated before him of themselves, and allowed him to pass through unhurt. And when he had passed, he saw them close themselves again and stand up like a great wall behind him. He entered the castle and looked around him with astonishment. In the courtyard were horses with their grooms, fast asleep. The pigeons, too, sat sleeping upon the roof and hid their little heads under their wings. And when he came into the house, he saw the very flies asleep upon the walls. The cook held her hand as if she would seize the kitchen girl by the hair, and the maid sat with the black fowl before her, which she was going to pluck. He went on farther, and as he went, he saw the guards all asleep at their posts. Then he came into the great hall, and he saw all the courtiers sleeping there. He walked on again, and all was so still that he could hear his own breath. And at last he went up a winding stair, and opened the door of the chamber in which Thornrose slept, and not far from where she lay were the king and queen themselves. He went near to the princess, and as she lay there, all still and motionless, she looked so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off her. At last he stooped down and gave her a kiss. As soon as he had touched her cheek, Thornrose opened her eyes, woke up, and looked round her with a friendly smile. Then she arose, and the prince and she went down the stair together. And now the king and queen and the whole court awoke, and rubbed their eyes, and looked with wonder at each other. The horses also awoke, and neighed and shook themselves. The greyhounds sprang to their feet and wagged their tails. The doves on the housetop drew their heads from under their wings, looked round, and flew away into the meadow. The flies on the wall began to creep along. The fire in the kitchen flickered and flamed up. The roast began to hiss. The old cook gave the kitchen girl a box on the ear that made her scream. The maid, too, was seen busily plucking away at the fowl. To crown the whole, the wedding of Thornrose and the king's son was celebrated with great feasting and rejoicings, and they lived in peace and happiness all their days. Notes: The Sleeping Beauty. One of Perrault's tales. This is the Dornröschen of Grimm. This is almost certainly a nature myth of the earth sleeping in winter till kissed by the warm rays of the spring sun, and it betokens a northern origin. The spindle is the sleep thorn wherewith, in the Norse myth, the Valkyrie Brunhild was sent to sleep by Odin. In the ancient myth, the Sleeping Beauty was surrounded by the Waberlo, or Wall of Flame, till Sigurd came and released her. This myth has acquired fresh vitality from its adoption into Wagner's marvelous cycle of opera, The Ring of the Nibelungen. Perrault took the tale from the Pentamerone.